Hello, everyone, and welcome. I apologize for keeping you all waiting in the waiting room for a few extra minutes. We're having a couple of little technical issues. My name is Melanie Burnitz. I'm the Interim Executive Vice President for University Life and the Senior Vice President for Columbia Health. Thank you for joining us today for the Votes Are In, Reflections on the Election. I'd also like to thank CEPA for making this event possible by co-sponsoring it. And today we're going to dig into the results of this year's presidential election and explore how we got here and the potential impact stemming from the incoming administration. To guide us through this very complex topic, we're fortunate to have a wonderful group of scholars joining us for this moderated discussion, which will be followed by a Q&A. So please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you. We'll be collecting them in the background. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists and moderator. Please keep in mind these are very abbreviated bios. We encourage you to look each of them up so you can get a true sense of their full list of accomplishments. First up, our moderator, Juan Manuel Benítez, the Philip S. Balboni Professor of Professional Practice of Local Journalism at the Columbia Journalism School. Professor Benítez has worked as a New York City-based bilingual journalist for more than 2 decades, covering politics, climate change, and the Latinx community. Professor Benítez has extensively covered the administrations of Mayors Michael Bloomberg, Bill de Blasio, and Eric Adams, as well as countless political campaigns, including Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's 2008 primary for the Democratic presidential nomination and the 2016 presidential election. He's also served as a moderator and panelist in many electoral debates. And our panelists include Jonathan E. Collins, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Education at Teachers College and Associate Director of the Center for Educational Equity. Professor Collins' research focuses on race and ethnic politics, urban politics, state and local politics, education politics and policy, and democratic theory. As a researcher, he's been at the forefront of the study of public participation at school board meetings. His book in progress, Democracy Speaks: School Board Governance Through Deliberative Culture, demonstrates how democratic school board governance facilitates urban education policy reform. He's also written on African-American vote and behavior, civics education, local election reform, and school finance policy. With us today is also Tamar, Assistant Professor of International and Public Affairs at CEPA, and a member of the Data Science Institute and the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. Professor Mitt's work focuses on several board questions. What role does social media play during conflict and civil war? How do violent and nonviolent movements use the internet to advance their cause? And in what ways can media be manipulated to shape public opinion? Professor Mitz is currently working on a new book, Moderating Extremism, the Challenge of Combating Online Harms, which explains why militant organizations flourish online despite global efforts to clamp down on harmful content on social media platforms. Next, we have Timothy Naftali, Senior Research Scholar at CEPA, who's a pioneer in the study of modern international and espionage history and is a well-recognized presidential historian. Dr. Naftali was founding director of the Federal Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in 2007, where he curated a nationally recognized nonpartisan permanent exhibit on Watergate and oversaw the release of 1.3 million pages of records. He's the author, co-author, and editor of 8 books, including a biography of George Herbert Walker Bush and histories of U.S. counterterrorism policy and of presidential impeachment. He also serves as a presidential historian for CNN. And last but certainly not least is Robert Shapiro, the Wallace S. South Professor of Government and Professor at CEPA. Professor Shapiro has taught at Columbia since 1982 and specializes in American politics with research and teaching interests in public opinion, policymaking, political leadership, the mass media, and applications of statistical methods. His current research examines partisan polarization and ideological politics in the United States, as well as other topics concerned with public opinion and policymaking. So with that impressive group of panelists, I will hand things off to our moderator, Professor Benítez. Over to you.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you everybody for being with us today. I want to start talking about the election and in context, because we still have a lot of Americans shocked by the results, a historic victory for former President Donald Trump, will become a president again in January. And many Americans, well, many are happy, some of them are disappointed, but they are trying to understand how Donald Trump and his politics came back to the United States and to the White House. And Tamar, I wanted to start with you to see whether this victory by Donald Trump is an anomaly, or does it follow a trend that we've seen the last few years in other Western democracies?
Yes, thank you so much also for having me in this terrific panel. So yeah, I think it's a really great question to start with, because we can definitely point to a lot of aspects of the current election that are unique, that are different, that are maybe surprising or maybe less surprising. But I think thinking about the United States elections in the context of the global trends we've seen is I think really important. And one of the things that we've seen, especially in Western countries, but not only, is somewhat of a similar trends. So when we look at what drives the rise of populist leaders, like many would define President-elect Trump, is related to trends we've seen globally. So, for example, a lot of voting populations in many countries are frustrated with rising inequality, job insecurity, other aspects of globalization that are affecting perhaps their own individual lives, that are leading them to, become attracted to messaging by populist leaders that offer a different way to address their personal concerns. We're also seeing people feeling threatened by demographic shifts, often related to international immigration, emphasizing nationalistic sentiments or the protection of traditional values and things like that often we see in the messaging campaigns of elected leaders that have similar policy preferences like the current like what we've seen in the US in the current elections is something we've seen happen in other countries as well. So in some ways, this is actually not an anomaly. There's actually a lot of similar parallels we can point to other countries that have had elected leaders that promote similar sort of sentiments. I would also add a couple more points about this is that one of the things we've also seen globally is this growing distrust with current elites and institutions, and also the growing roles of polarization that are essentially facilitating that sort of us versus them dynamic that can also perhaps lead some people to prefer elected officials or candidates that kind of point to current institutions as corrupt, as unresponsive to citizens' needs. So things like that is are trends we have seen in other countries as well. And in some ways, what we have seen here in this election right now reflects similar trends in many ways, I would say.
Thank you. And Robert, in terms of putting this in context, in US history, how does Trump's victory and his return to the White House, how does it fit in the context of what we've seen in the last more than 200 years?
Well, my time horizon on this is really perhaps the last 50 to 70 years. And to put Trump in context, first, let's put Trump aside. In terms of trends in American politics, what we've seen since the 1950s, especially since the 1970s, is a development in American politics whereby we now have two ideologically distinct political parties. We have a party on the left and a party on the right. What we've also had are increasingly competitive elections, not just for the presidency. During the 20th century, the presidency would bounce back between the parties. But for a good part of the 20th century, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives and the Senate, so that Republican presidents typically faced divided government, whereas Democratic presidents had unified government. But the Democratic Party, at least in the earlier part of the century, was consisted of an uneasy coalition of a Southern conservative faction and a liberal Northern faction. That all changed. There's a long history. We don't have time to go into that, but in recent years, the parties have been ideologically distinctive on basically all issues. elections have become more competitive because of the realignment of the parties in the United States, whereby the South left the Democratic Party and were picked up by the Republican Party. So we've had increasingly close elections. Elections matter, have become highly emotional, to the point where there's this phenomenon in the study of political science called affective partisanship, where the parties are no longer, are not simply at odds on issues, but they're at odds in the sense that they take politics personal, and whereby Democrats emotionally dislike Republicans, Republicans emotionally dislike Democrats, and add to this mix the rise of Donald Trump, who's added to this mix certain anti-democratic tendencies, denial of election results, and the like. So that really set the stage for the current election. Now, the way political scientists view the current election is in American politics is twofold. One is in the context of what's been happening internationally. You've had disgruntlement with incumbent governments, and so one conclusion about this election has been that this election was decided basically on the perceived poor performance of the Biden-Harris administration, and what voters did was simply vote them out because they were dissatisfied. The other trend here has been an internal realignment of the parties, and it's not this isn't at odds with this throwing out the incumbent party, but it's led to demographic changes in the base of the parties, whereby the Democratic Party is no longer the party of the working man and woman. The Republican Party has been the party of that group, defined in terms of not so much occupation, but defined in terms of whether they have college degrees or not. In addition to that, you've got this realignment occurring in terms of the Democratic base of support among minority groups, Blacks, Latinos, and Asians. And the Republican Party has been able to make inroads among that group. It's actually the party of Trump that's been able to make inroads among that group. And that produced the current victory of Trump in the election. Now, keep in mind here, this election was very close. And the latest data basically shows that Trump has won, but has received fewer than 50% of the vote. It was thought he had more than that. We're talking about a difference of about 2.5 million votes. And the electoral vote was decided based on approximately, at the current count, 237,000 votes in 3 states, compared to what happened in 2016, where Trump won the election by 70,000 votes in 3 states, and Biden won in 2020 by about 40,000 votes in 3 states. So we've really had an increasingly close election. And the one phenomenon that's been occurring because of the competitiveness of the political parties and the realignment that occurred in the parties, over the last 6 elections, we've had a president entering office with partisan control of the House of Representatives and the Senate. We've had unified government, which means that the parties are far apart. A president enters office with a coalition of support in the House and the Senate, whereby the president can enact, at least initially within the window of the first 2 years, major changes in policy. We've seen this in recent years. Cases in point were, Trump's tax reform, Biden's major spending initiatives after COVID, the passage of the Affordable Care Act by Obama. These would not have happened without this kind of unified government. And now we have Trump with unified government poised to take some very decisive actions as we speak.
We were talking about working class voters and how many of them have opted for the Republican Party in this case. And my whole career, I've been trying to explain to people that Hispanic voters, they don't only care about immigration. They're just like average voters who care about prices and jobs and education and inflation. But we've seen something really interesting, even here in New York City. You see the maps with the election data, and some parts of the Bronx, of Queens, have seen huge gains for the Republicans this last election. We're talking about realignment, but I want to go a little further than that, because we know that the Democrats for a long time, they've been trying to keep that coalition of minority voters, Hispanic voters, Black voters, in some extent also Asian voters all over the country. So we always spoke about identity politics. There's a long tradition of identity politics, not only in the country, but also here in New York City. So Jonathan, I wanted to talk to you about this. Is it that identity politics, as we've known for decades, and as some parties, in this case, the Democratic Party has used for decades, is that kind of politics, is that dead now after this election?
Well, that's a great question. I wouldn't go as far as to say that identity, or I'll look at these two things distinctly. I see. So on one end, there's a question of identity politics. And this is more so about the assemblage of a political coalition that coalesces around showing a certain sort of respect or tolerance for different kinds of social identities. And is sort of that version of identity politics dead? That's the conversation. The distinction, though, is multiracial democracy. And, this is more so about a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition of citizens who are coalesce around a certain set of ideas that are rooted in, societal progression that benefits people across different racial and ethnic groups. That prospect is very much still alive. And I think that idea is what is sort of instrumental for, I think, the Democratic Party in particular, but for both parties moving forward. And so let's get into the distinction and kind of why this matters. So is identity politics dead? What we saw was the Democratic Party seemed to really rely on relatively strong identity-based appeals. And as a result, we saw the Democratic Party receive some of the lowest vote share distribution that we've seen in modern presidential politics history. So, Kamala Harris receives the lowest vote share of Black Democratic support of any nominee since 2000, one of the lowest Black Democratic vote share we've seen since 1972. And this is incredible given that there is an African-American woman at the head of the ticket. You look at, but the margins here are very slim, but from a ranking standpoint, she's receiving some of the lowest amount of Black voter support we've seen in presidential election history. When you look at Latino, Hispanic voters, this is where the damage is really done. She received the second lowest vote share we've seen in modern history for any Democratic nominee. Similar results with Asian Americans. So what Kamala Harris was unable to do was to pull the Rainbow Coalition together, despite making appeals that were rooted in supporting different types of racial and ethnic identities. What was missing, a lot of the exit polling is revealing. Now, also caveat there, how much stock we put in exit polling should be limited. These are not representative samples that should be extrapolated to have a certain level of external validity beyond the specific sample that is utilized in the exit poll. But what we're seeing is that, similar to what Professor Shapiro is suggesting, that voters of color really cared about more sort of central policy related issues. It was more about the economy. It was more, about, jobs and access. It was more about the inflation problem than it was, some of these more descriptive representational issues that we saw the campaign sort of focus on quite a bit. And so, moving forward, I think the question is not necessarily will identity matter? It's a question of, well, how will identity intersect with some of these sort of core presidential policy related issues, like the economy, like putting money in people's back pockets, like ensuring that purses are full, like ensuring that the inflation problem is ameliorated. And so there's a bit of, on the surface, it seems like there's nothing new here, but underneath the surface, again, you're seeing almost kind of a growing impatience from voters of color with purely symbolic politics.
Yeah, you're right. Because when you see exit polling, sometimes you have to be careful about that kind of those numbers. On the other hand, some of those exit polls showed that Donald Trump got 46% of the Hispanic vote. That's the highest number for a Republican candidate since George W. Bush, even surpassing what George W. Bush got in 2004. And then you go to different neighborhoods in the city, and you see how the data, the election board data, shows a trend towards the Republican Party in some areas, for example, Hispanic heavy areas in the Bronx, and even some Hispanic neighborhoods in Queens. Trump won the vote, beat Kamala Harris on November 5th. Now the question is, Tim, is this just because of Donald Trump? Is this because the Republican Party has done a successful effort to attract other voters that were traditionally Democratic voters? Or is this just because the Democratic candidate was not likable or not to, she couldn't get into she couldn't offer any alternative to those voters that they were happy with? Is this going to be a long-term trend, or is this just a one-time thing? Because we've seen in some of these neighborhoods how voters voted for the Democrat when it comes to other races, but voted for Trump when it comes to the presidential race. I think you're muted, Tim.
Imagine how many years have we been doing this? I apologize for being muted. Thank you for asking me, Juan. Well, you know, Theodore White, the classic analyst of presidential elections in The Making of the President in 1960, which is the first of a series of landmark books, wrote, I think really wisely, that we really cannot know, we can never know as analysts and historians, political scientists, what finally drives the individual voter to make her or his decision. But I think Bob's analysis of the role of meat and potatoes issues in the economy is very important to keep in mind. And the fact that presidents as unpopular as Joe Biden was during this election cycle, whether it was right or not, the presidents that unpopular just don't win. And people associated with that kind of administration don't win traditionally. What that means going forward is extraordinarily important to ask. Generally, you don't ask a historian to tell you what's going to happen forward. We're much better looking behind us. But I would like to lay out a couple of things for all of you listening to consider as we move forward. The first thing to consider is, why wasn't January 6th a disqualifying event for a return to power by Donald Trump? Why was the fact that he was convicted for a felony in the state of New York not itself a disqualifying event? Why is the fact that he has also clearly thumbed his nose, I could use an even more colorful phrase, at the U.S. government when it wanted a return of his presidential papers, which, by the way, are owned by the American people, and thus was indicted for it? Why didn't that matter at all? It's the least important, I understand, of all of these issues. In other words, what is it about Donald Trump that made him the Teflon candidate? And part of the answer to your question is the Trump phenomenon. To what extent are we witnessing a series of historical outcomes that are linked to simply one personality, one charismatic leader? We don't know. But we know that there's going to be a test of that, because Donald Trump is human and will pass from the scene. And he's already set in motion a succession, which would be led by J.D. Vance and maybe members of his own family. So we will actually see the test of the importance of charisma. But leaving that one question aside, which I think is very important, there are two other questions I'd like to get at quickly that I think will help answer your question as events answer it, because I don't think an individual could answer it with full confidence. The other is the turn towards populism in not only the United States, but throughout the world. And populism led by people without college degrees, and their expectations in a world of changing economic institutions and opportunities. As manufacturing jobs have disappeared in the developed world, what's left are jobs that require more education than was required by manufacturing workers in a previous generation. There aren't as many assembly lines anymore. Robots have taken over that work. To be in a manufacturing job today, you often need a college degree. So the opportunities for economic advancement for people who do not have college degrees have declined. And what jobs are available are not providing enough money to keep families going. That's a problem across the developed world. To what extent will our politics respond to that, whether on the left or the right? So far, the right has responded more effectively to that than the left. And the third question is the question that you discussed earlier, which is the extent to which the cultural elements of the Democratic message have fallen flat, and that Democrats are actually finding themselves unable to compete in various states in the country. And this will be a problem for them in the Senate. There is a structural problem for Democrats if they can't compete in over 25 states in this country. They will not be able to control, they will not be in the majority in the Senate again. So how is it they can tailor their cultural message to be more acceptable to larger groups of people in the states where right now Democrats are doing very poorly? Those are the three questions that I would raise in a way to answering your bigger question.
And obviously, Donald Trump was already president. 4 years ago, he left the White House, and now he's coming back. We've seen other leaders in other countries with a similar speech or a similar platform getting to power in other countries. And the message from the Democratic candidate during the election was freedom and saving democracy. So Tamar, looking at other examples, can we expect an erosion of democratic institutions, or I guess like a lower quality of our democracy in the next 4 years in this second Trump presidency?
Yeah, that's one of the big questions to watch in my mind. What we've seen, what the Democratic campaign has tried to highlight a lot is this, as you're saying, this risk to democracy. But if we look, at past actions or how Trump is positioned to erode democracy more, I would say that in the next administration, he would be more free to do that if he wanted, particularly by appointing loyalists to different positions. And one of the striking aspects of that for me, and that also comes from research that has been done in other countries on kind of why voters who see candidates who may erode democracy if they're in office, why do they nonetheless vote for them? And oftentimes the answer, and this is consistent across different contexts, that sometimes partisanship or policy preferences trump that kind of democratic norms, or like this desire to uphold democracy when that comes in tension. So I think that's something I believe we kind of saw here as well. So those issues that voters really cared about seem to have been more crucial and important for them, as opposed to protecting democracy. So if you were to compare the two, and I think that that's something definitely to watch, is how do the institutions in the United States continue to function as they should in the context where we have somebody who has shown in the past and has used rhetoric that seems to be likely to erode democracy or democratic institutions. So I think that's definitely something we want to be watching for in the coming years.
And I know that we cannot predict the future, but at least let's talk about how we expect the first 100 days of the second Trump administration, how those days are going to be. And let me start with Robert, and then we'll go to Jonathan and to Tim. Do we expect massive changes in policy? Do we expect Donald Trump that is going to be a dictator on day one? What are the major changes or the things to expect in the next 100 years once he takes office? Robert?
Well, the next 100 days, and actually the first part of the first 2 years, are the window of opportunity that he has. Keep in mind here, he has unified control of government. That is, he has a Republican House and Senate, and he has control of appointments to the federal bureaucracy and appointments to the courts. This is his window of opportunity. Now, a normal president would be looking at this opportunity to put forward his policy agenda to improve the quality of life in the United States and the world. And he has certain pieces of legislation in mind with regard to tax cuts and perhaps other things as well. The thing that we are all mindful of, and I'm sure Timothy and Tamar and Jonathan have been thinking in this way as well. What kinds of things will he be doing to erode American democracy and promote authoritarianism? Not necessarily any drastic, claims of power in a big way, but incremental things to move in a more authoritarian direction. And we've seen these incremental things. He's talking about mobilizing the army to deal with immigrants. He's talking about ending the vetting of political appointments. He's talking about recess appointments, by which he would be commanding, authority that presidents have not done before. And what else might he be doing? Is he going to arrest his political enemies, members of the previous administration? Arresting Joe Biden is kind of out of the picture because Joe Biden has immunity now, thanks to the courts. But other people are vulnerable here. And so the question is, what are the rail guards that are left to constrain him? And my own view is, I think the courts are very important here. Oh, and also he's talking about dealing with prior members of the military, court-martialing them. Well, that's an interesting kind of phenomenon that is going after the army. We've heard that before in the past, with echoes of Joe McCarthy here. So there are a lot of things to watch that really reflect efforts by Trump to undermine democracy. And then the other thing working against him and the Republicans here is we had a free and fair election. And that really offsets the claims that were made that led to January 6th. And that's something to keep in mind here. Thank you.
Jonathan?
Am I here?
Yes. So what do you expect for the first 100 days of the second Trump term?
Yes. Well, I think Professor Shapiro, I think Bob laid it out perfectly. The only thing that I'll add there is also expect a lot of things done through executive order. So when we saw the first Trump presidency beginning in 2016, Trump actually in that term issued the most executive orders during a president in a single term since Jimmy Carter. And this is with Trump coming in as a relative political novice who didn't have much experience with the inner workings of the powers of the executive office. You listen to Trump speak more recently, and the thing that he comes in to the position with now is experience. He has a handle on how to get things accomplished. Before in 2016, he didn't know the process for vetting cabinet nominees and figuring out, who to be a part of his sort of bureaucratic cabinet. In 2024, we've seen the nominee selections come in rapid fire. He is hitting the ground running, and expect executive orders to be one area in which he does that. I think, the thing that I'll add though, as a maybe a note of contrast to this is, while you should expect the first 100 days to be very rapid in terms of potentially using the executive powers in ways that we haven't seen before, more aggressive usage of executive powers. Thinking about it again, executive orders is one of those powers. But the trend that we've seen from Trump policy-wise has been to dictate a lot of power to the states and try to empower states. You look at the course of action that he's taken around, for instance, like abortion rights, for example. This is one in which he has his position has evolved over time, but the main consistent theme there is that he really tries to empower states to make those decisions. And so look for issues where Trump decides to either increase his own use of power strictly through the executive branch versus relying on the courts and trying to kick powers back to empowering the states that supported him in 2024.
Tim?
Donald Trump's power grab has already started. The way in which he is, if you will, flooding the zone with his appointments, and very controversial appointments, is a test of his future congressional control. It's not a test of Democrats. He knows what the Democrats are going to do in response. He's testing the Republicans. I think it's important to keep in mind how much power is personal for Donald Trump. One of the things he wants to do is he wants revenge. He wants revenge for the 2 impeachment processes against him. He wants a revenge, particularly against those Republicans he didn't feel were adequately loyal. So I'll be watching to see how many of his appointees actually get confirmed, how many he's going to try to put in place during a congressional recess. Once we see the extent to which he can cow the Senate, we'll have a sense of the extent to which he'll use executive authority, executive orders, as opposed to legislation to push forward on 3 very important areas for him. Very quickly, one is deportation of undocumented Americans, and also the use, perhaps, of a law from 1798, which would allow him actually to deport green card holders. 2, tariffs. He's promised tariffs. He can do them with executive orders, but he can also do them through Congress. And the third one, he'll be approaching the issue of taxes. That he'll have to do with Congress. I suspect he will have a majority in the House. We just don't know how much of a majority. But those are the 3 areas I see a lot of activity from him. But the extent to which he uses executive orders will depend on the extent to which he has cowed the Senate. And that we will only know when we see how many of his nominees are confirmed. It's possible all of them could be confirmed. It's also possible that 1 or 2 of them might not be confirmed, which, by the way, would be very unusual for a president whose party actually controls the Senate.
And Tamar, this is a really important question that everybody's been thinking about. How is this no Trump victory going to impact America's, the U.S. alliances when it comes to NATO, when it comes to the European Union, the traditional allies that the U.S. has had for the last few decades? Do you think that there is going to be a real impact? Do you think that Trump is going to change the game as it has been known for the last few decades?
Yeah, so I think this is another really interesting area. So unlike the previous administration, where Trump was a newcomer and people didn't really know what to expect, I think part of his behavior, people like to call like the madman, theory, or somebody who is not somewhat unexpected behavior. I think this time around, people in other countries have a bit more of an expectation of how he is likely to behave and what is his foreign policy preferences are. And I think that that's perhaps the expectation is that they would behave accordingly. So other experts at our school and university have pointed to really interesting dimensions, and I'm going to be mentioning Professor Elizabeth Saunders, who is an expert in foreign policy here. And one of the things that she often points to when we think about alliances and foreign policies more specifically, she talked about how Trump historically is known to not like multilateral alliances and preferring more bilateral relationships where there is some sort of agreements to be struck that will especially help the US economically. He's also known to be critical of trade agreements that he perceives as unfair, and he's more open than perhaps other presidents to discuss and negotiate with authoritarian leaders. So I think all of these three dimensions are going to be something that we will see the foreign policy agenda of this administration focusing on. And in terms of NATO specifically, Trump he's known to be critical of NATO in particular, sees it as a financial burden to the US, and probably will likely to see this kind of rhetoric coming back, specifically calling for other members of NATO to contribute more to the alliance. So yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting space to watch, but at the same time, perhaps not as surprising as before, because I think there is more knowledge about his preferences and his behavior on the global scene.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the audience, and I'm going to start with one that I guess has to do with me and my colleagues, because one of some people in our audience are wondering whether the media played a significant role in the re-election, in this case, the election of Donald Trump. Should we blame the media for covering Trump the way the media has done, not only this time, but also before his first victory in 2016? And before I take your answers, I just want to clarify that, I mean, democracy is democracy, and all voters deserve respect, and I don't think we should imply in any way that voters have been fooled by the media or one politician into voting for one option or another. But taking a turn or turning that question in a different way, is it that Donald Trump, who for decades in New York City was a darling of the press, is it that he's always been extremely adept at playing the game with newspapers, television networks? He knows how to get publicity and or bad publicity that is going to generate attention, that is going to translate into votes. Robert?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that Trump from the outset benefited from a lot of free media to basically enable him to be the center of attention and take time away from news coverage of the opposition and other things. With regard to this particular election, I think all of that was sort of baked in. I think the fact that the economy and other aspects of the poor performance of the Biden administration were decisive in the election. His ability to kind of dominate the media and kind of emphasizing that message was probably important. But I think once that was baked into the election, that made it very difficult for Kamala Harris to win. And so I see the role of the media as being less relevant there. Just imagine what the election would have been like if the southern border were under control, minimal inflation, and no debacle in Afghanistan.
Jonathan, what's your take?
Similar position here in that Trump definitely benefits from free media coverage. Donald Trump he's the entertainer in chief. He has his background in reality television and knows how to sort of like generate a captive audience. And so, there's a book about that captures a part of this empirically. It's called Identity Crisis. It's by John Sides, Michael Tesler, and Lynn Davrick. They're three political scientists, and they studied this phenomenon in the 2016 election. And what they show is that the television media companies like CNN, MSNBC, Fox News all major media outlets were covering the Trump campaign more than the Clinton campaign. The same thing was happening here in 2024, where it was to the point where you would see you would see an empty podium when Trump is about to speak, almost as much as you would even see a footage of Kamala Harris actually speaking during the election. So he definitely benefits because news outlets know the more that they put Trump on the screen, the better their ratings, the higher their viewers. The higher their views. Trump knows this, he leverages this, he benefits from this. But ultimately, you know, it's a relatively simple math game. You know, Donald Trump receives about 2 million more votes than he received in 2020 when he lost to Joe Biden. Kamala Harris receives about 8 million fewer votes than Joe Biden received in 2020. Clearly, the issue is more of Biden voters not returning for Harris than it is Trump being this sort of major mobilization force that shifted millions and millions of voters onto his side. You know, again, and everything can be explained by, you know, looking at the economy and economic performance, the low approval ratings for Joe Biden and the administration, not necessarily anything that was happening particularly with regard to the media.
Tim?
Oh, I agree with both Jonathan and Bob. If you look at the Democrats, their strategy was that they felt they had people on the ground who could get the vote out, that they knew how to mobilize their voters. And in fact, Kamala Harris, despite the fact she had a historically short campaign, had a lot of money. And there were a lot of people in Pennsylvania who were knocking on doors, and that failed. And so the media, while the media certainly played a role in keeping Donald Trump, you know, in our space, a lot of the coverage of Donald Trump in this campaign was negative. Keep in mind that there was a lot of discussion of January 6th. There was a lot of discussion of the fact that he was a felon. Some of you might remember in the final days of the campaign, there was a lot of discussion of the rally at the Madison Square Garden and depictions of Donald Trump by some of former members of his national security team and his chief of staff as a fascist. That was also part of the mediascape. So yes, he got a lot of attention, but it wasn't all very positive. And finally, the work that was supposed to work to get people out to vote didn't. So the strategy that the Democrats had failed. So the media, I don't think, as Bob mentioned, I don't think the media was as significant a player in 2024 as it had been in 2016 for making Donald Trump more of a celebrity than he already was. Donald Trump was well known in 2024. The question was whether the American people would treat him as a normal candidate or would keep in mind January 6th, his felony conviction, and the chaos of his first term. In the end, at least 50% of Americans, or at least close to 50% of the electorate, decided he was a normal candidate. And in this particular era, given the economy that we have, or at least the perception of the economy, a normal candidate who is a change agent will win.
And we only have time for one more question and a 1-minute answer from each of you. One of our viewers is asking whether we live in a bubble. And the way I want to pose this question to all of you is, I'm sure that you've experienced the same thing that I did the day after the election. I had students who were shocked, surprised, they were worried about the result of the election. And my response to them, journalism students, was, listen, this is a great time for being a reporter. You should go out there, talk to people, and report the findings. And many of them weren't surprised with the results because they had covered early voting in New York City, and they had already talked to minority voters in New York City who were telling them they were going to vote for Trump. So what are you telling your students when they come to you asking for an explanation for what's happened? And let's start with you, Tamar.
I think that's a great question. And I think that there is a desire for people to be surrounding themselves with people that think that like them or are kind of perceived as an in-group. And I think that's a threat to everybody, including all of us here. And I think that this election does show how much we do need to be plugged in, not just to the people that think like us, but also people who may disagree with us, and understand their perspective and understand where they're coming from and what are their concerns. So that's definitely I personally bring to my class and my students, is try to understand an issue from different perspectives and try to understand where different people are coming from. And I think that's something that we should all be doing.
Thank you, Robert.
Well, I mean, what I would emphasize, I mean, in terms of learning from all this, two things I'd emphasize. One is we've learned that even the American democracy has a certain element of frailty to it that we need to be very mindful of. On the upside, the response to this election is what happens in the next election, and whether certain kinds of cyclical things happen. Typically, what's happened with presidents elected with unified government, by the time the midterm election comes around, they lose control of one of the houses of Congress, and that kind of, you know, tends to mitigate certain kinds of things. The other thing that's clear, and I just want to echo a point Timothy made. Where January 6th fits into all this has to do with political memory. And the thing that I would watch for is to see whether we're going to be engaged in observing a certain kind of revisionist history in interpreting and remembering January 6th, similar to the kind of revisionist history that occurred in the American South after the Civil War, which kind of for a long time obliterated the fact that the war was a war about slavery and injustice.
Jonathan, in 1 minute.
I'll be really brief here. I think there are two things, sort of two explanations that are kind of distant from one another, but I think go together. You know, the first one is something that we haven't talked about, is that it just seems that America is not ready for a woman president. We had a Black woman at the head of the ticket, and it's hard not to see racism and sexism to some degree playing a role here. Is it the total explanation? Absolutely not, but it played somewhat of a significant role. The other thing is this kind of growing sort of degree divide and the distance between us kind of coastal elites that I think gets at the undertone of the question, and, you know, the sort of working class all across America. I think the next iteration of presidential elections, we need to see that divide shrink. We need to see campaigns that are rooted in ways that bring both the coast and middle America together. And, you know, that's what I think we should be looking for moving forward.
Thank you. Tim?
I think we just have to encourage everybody to read something or watch something that they're not accustomed to watching or reading. I think the problem is not just the university bubble, and that is a real problem. It's that all Americans are in bubbles, and their bubbles are reinforcing certain assumptions they have. And a lot of it has to do with the algorithms of these social media reels that we look at every day. So I think one of the challenges in this democracy, in this new era of technology, is to figure out a way for us to talk to each other and to have actual conversations across divides. And that, I think, is the way forward. I'm rather optimistic about it. If I weren't optimistic about it, I wouldn't be a teacher.
Tamar, Robert, Jonathan, and Tim, thank you so much. And thank you for the great conversation. I'll take it back to you, Melanie.
Thank you. And on behalf of University Life, I'd like to give a big thank you to you, Professor Benítez, and to each of our panelists for sharing their time, thoughts, and expertise today. I'd also like to thank again our co-sponsor, SEPA, for partnering with us to host this event. I think we could have gone on for another 3 hours or so, but I hope the discussion helped you to think more deeply about the election results and the state of our democracy. We have recorded this and we'll be posting this for those who arrived late or want to encourage others to watch it. And today's event was part of University Life's calendar of events. And to find out more about our programming, other initiatives, please check our website, which is universitylife.columbia.edu. Lastly, thank you to the audience for joining us today. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your wonderful questions, but take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.